And one of the more important meta conversations about this topic, I want to acknowledge the heightened level of fear. Maybe it goes up to a 4 out of 10, 10 being absolutely terrified out of your mind. Uh, each time I make one of these recordings. And this is speaking to a set of experiences which determine whether transparency is equated with danger or transparency is related to attunement and protection and support. So in early formative years, when one communicates and is thus transparent, when that communication is met with attunement, then transparency gets associated with safety. When it's met with anger, with particularly explosive anger experienced as an infant as trauma and threat to survival, then every time one is seen, there is an element of fear. There's an underlying memory that seeing could get one killed. And I experience that every single time I make one of these recordings. And I think that there's two levels of programming here. The first level is that being seen is associated with abandonment, hurt, and betrayal. The other is that showing an unfavorable light to the authority figure, to the caregiver, is associated with traumatic abuse. So if being seen is associated with abandonment and pain, and being critical of authority is associated with being hit and survival in jeopardy, those two combine to create a feeling of being hit, being hated, and not being cared about every time I speak truths in these areas. So I just want to acknowledge that. And this is in conflict with intellect and an earlier childhood drive to be seen in order to be helped. Meaning every child instinctually has a biology that tells them they're being born into a perfect world and that all they have to do is be completely visible in all their sounds and faces and movements, and that the environment will respond in order to attune and to create a loving, nurturing environment. And this is a learned process of convincing a child that that's not the case. That if you're seen in this situation or that situation or this situation, you will in fact be hurt or ignored or marginalized or humiliated. And this creates a sense of panic because the youngest parts still want to be seen. They still have to believe in order to grow and survive that there's someone out there that cares about them. But the body is telling them that's not actually the case. And so it pits these two drives to be seen and to hide against one another in the template with a strong relationship. And this creates the feeling that I have of speaking up, but a part of me closing my eyes, clenching my fists, and feeling absolutely helpless and enraged as I expect to be hit. And how this associates as I make these recordings is I become more physically explosive. If something is in my way, there's an impulse to knock it out of my way, to counteract and balance out the helplessness that is induced by choosing to be visible in what is anticipated to be a sociopathic environment. So that's a meta context for all of these recordings. In that hyper-vigilant state of expecting to be hit, I am, of course, incredibly defensive. And in that defensiveness, much more controlling. Any interruption is, of course, just feels like an absolute outrage and big deal. So we're dealing with 1 to 2 year old very frightened parts with an older self rationally going ahead and saying, if we're in an emotionally and psychologically and traumatically illiterate culture, the first thing someone has to do is talk about it. And since one should think globally and act locally, i.e. think about what other people should do and then do it, that means me talking about it. That's the obvious rational conclusion. And that is the presiding persona in these interactions. So that rational part is dictating the behavior, even as a 2-year-old inside is absolutely heartbroken and devastated by the choice of the older self to go and do things that has gotten them hit, hated, and abandoned. And as an older self in this culture, I have not learned to differentiate those two parts successfully. I haven't learned to educate and be kind to the small part. And I, as the older part, am frightened by the level of reactivity that comes up in my body from the young parts. So all of that is going on in the subtext. And I have a little bit of a counterphobic approach where, because there were so many no-win situations, the kind of ultimate response that comes in, particularly as a child with 2 juvenile parents, meaning repressed, regressed, traumatized children in grown-up bodies, to be counterphobic, that the only way that I'm going to live and survive is to do the opposite of what I'm terrified of. So part of me dissociates, part of me clenches, part of me waits to be hit, and the other part does what seems like the intelligent thing to do. And that part has a lot of support, because when I do the intelligent thing to do, a large percentage of the time, particularly when dealing with objective areas of reality, not people, nature, objects, etc., the right thing leads to the right result. When dealing with people in a dysfunctional culture, it's often the opposite. Doing the right thing results in being punished, being challenged, being disliked, being avoided, being ignored, being attacked. Because the reasons my parents were dysfunctional had very little to do with them as individuals, and had an enormous amount to do with what it was like to grow up in their generation. My father grew up with the World War II veteran generation. And so when he was 6 years old, and his father had PTSD from a shell wound in his knee in France, then my grandfather would explosively hit my father to process the rage of feeling helpless, bleeding to death in a tank in a foreign land, and having a tank shell in one's knee. It's in a claustrophobic place. No one is responding to the wound. And he was dismissed from the army as if this was no big deal, as if the fact that he had PTSD was irrelevant. So he was a changed grandfather who became abusive to my father, and along with his alcoholic therapist of a mother, psychologist of a mother, who hated herself, there was no space for emotional bonding with either parent from my father. So he stopped growing up emotionally at age 6 and is terrified and helpless and has no way to process that as a regressed 6-year-old. You know, these things get passed on, and so someone raised by my father is going to be emotionally unregulated. Someone raised by my grandfather is going to be emotionally unregulated. A veteran, highly traumatized with PTSD with no treatment, is going to abuse their family. We know that statistically. We just don't respond because we're not adults. We don't know what adults are. So that's a little backdrop as we go into this segment.
Not only do children like Karen fail to develop a window of tolerance, but worse yet, their nervous systems become biased towards sympathetic hyperactivity, impulsive proximity-seeking, and fight-flight behavior, often diagnosed as oppositional defiant disorder.
I just want to acknowledge that it's been noted by the leading psychologists and trauma therapists, including Bessel van der Kolk, that the DSM manual, the Manual of Mental Emotional Disease that is being used to diagnose people, is basically a long list of largely traumatic symptoms being given fancy names. When you are hurt by the people closest to you, your only way of surviving is to be defiant, or it's at least one coping strategy. Now, if the defiance that medicates the disease of a grown-up child being inappropriately given the job of parent, the real disease is a culture that enables parents to have children without the competency to do so and with zero tribal oversight. However, the same dysfunctional culture that gives anyone with a penis and a vagina the legal authority to raise a child, despite the statistics, meaning you can look at a certain set of parents and say that there's an 80% chance that in this socioeconomic situation, in this neighborhood, with this race, and with this abuse history, that there's an 87% chance that this child will be fucked up. There may be a 95% chance that this child will be fucked up. The culture that refuses to look at that data, the culture that says, go ahead, have a child, it's your legal right, is a child culture. It's not any choice or right that an adult would participate in, because the adult self is the only part of the self that is defined by self-love and matures into being loving. That is what separates a grown-up from an adult. So it's not self-loving for the parent, and certainly not for the child, let alone the culture, to bring an organism into the world that has an 87 to 95% chance of being highly destructive to its planet, to its culture, to those around it, and to themselves. But we do it all the time, which defines us as an immature cult. Now, the same immature cult that provides that right goes ahead and labels the survival protocols of abused children as diseases, when the survival protocols of abused children are necessary coping strategies in many ways to advance and navigate the abuses of childhood. Now, when that doesn't happen, when the culture that is too sick to avoid parental abuse instead pathologizes the behavior that's allowing the child to survive an abusive environment, the child gets a new disease of shame from the cult, which is that their survival mechanisms are bad, which is a deeper message saying, please die, because the coping mechanisms that your body's telling you to use to survive are bad and unwanted, i.e., we do not want you to survive, we want you to die, which then leads to a division because every infant, every child needs love and belonging. If the only way to secure love and belonging is to attack the self, then that is exactly what the child does in a statistically large proportion of cases. That message, attack yourself or we will not love and welcome you, is a very deep wound, and it is ignored in what is an ever-increasing money-making manual called the DSM manuals, which cost, well, they make the manual company hundreds of millions of dollars every time they update it, because it's a monopoly. And so they update it regularly with absurd new descriptions, most of which are traumatic symptoms that are not dealt with in any intelligent way in the manual.
In childhood, and borderline personality disorder in adulthood. Or they become parasympathetically dominant, shut down, inhibited, hopeless, and helpless.
Now, this shutdown, hopeless, and helplessness is a very predictable state in the way that many children are raised. Unlike 99% of the cultures in human history, of which there have been at least 10,000 according to anthropologists, we think it's fine to have a single mother in a largely sociopathic and materialistic cult raise a child rather than to raise a child in a village, in a community, in a multi-generational family, in a more intimate tribal setting surrounded by nature, which is far more sane, meaning sanity has to do with integrity and consistency of patterns. And nature is incredibly consistent persistently. It's not personal. If you spend a lot of time in nature, you will learn nature's laws, and they're not personal. They don't change for one person to another. However, we have invented a cultural envelope and a material envelope and a software envelope that deviates in many ways from nature's laws, but also in America, where change is equated with newness, and newness is equated with better than oldness. There is a frenetic change in technology and social groupings and social memes, many of which are not consistent, rational, or are very person-specific. So unlike an apple tree, which provides an apple regardless of how you're feeling that day, mom becomes the new apple tree, and she says, I'm not going to feed you. You're going to go to your room if you don't do this. And mom's an alcoholic. One of our many inventions is an increasing amount of substance dependency in Western culture. So mom's an alcoholic who's nice one day and hates you the next day. In this type of environment, how can one feel anything else but helpless and depressed as a child, depending on this person in an isolated environment that is not protecting the child, depending on this person and not on anything as consistent and rational as nature, So we see a lot more mental and emotional disease in present-day culture than we saw in tribal environments.
Without initiative or energy, a state frequently mistaken for depression. There are no stronger evolutionary instincts than the attachment drive and its polar opposite, the animal defense survival responses.
Meaning, we are a herd mammalian species, and as monkeys, we understand biologically that being in community, that being in a tribe of monkeys is safer, is more intelligent, leads to longer life than being an isolated monkey. Isolated animals separate from their packs can't keep watch. They can't alert one another. And so they are hunted down by predators. This leads to the primary survival impulse in an infant to attach to the primary caregiver, usually the mother. However, when the mother is an addict, is traumatized, is regressed, in a culture that traumatizes her, but offers to sell her addictive medication, meaning in a capitalist cult, every problem is seen by companies as how do we make the most money out of this. So if we can make people feel guilty and ashamed in our advertising, and then sell them a product, and particularly a product that doesn't work, so they have to keep buying it, so they form a dependence, that is capitalistic success, a monopoly market of dependent clients who will keep paying to manage a problem that is culturally produced. Now, in GDP, or gross national product, this is considered a success as well. People are spending more money. The fact that they're spending more money buying things they don't need, addicting themselves on phones to escape their feelings, it doesn't matter. Within the paradigm of capitalism, this is a great success.
The tendencies of babies and young children to seek and maintain proximity, to explore the environment while using caregivers as a safe base, and to seek a parent figure when alarmed or distressed, have contributed to child safety and protection for centuries. Even when a parent appears frightened and is therefore frightening, the proximity-seeking drive can still be activated by anxiety about a parent's safety or moods. Primitive signs of this conflict between proximity and safety can be observed in orphanage-raised adoptees. At first, they often arch away from the adoptive mother's body or stiffen on contact.
When you have the primary drive to attach in order to survive, with the next primary drive to fight, flight, and freeze in response to sociopathic abuse and programming, you have the two deepest drives in the human animal fighting against one another. And as with any tug-of-war, if you spend 50% of your energy trying to attach to feel safe, and the other 50% of your energy trying to run away from your predator because it's the same person, your mother, your father, your teacher, your lover, your husband, your wife, you become exhausted by sending dual chemical messages to the body at the same time. Bond to be safe and get the hell out of here to be safe. That tug-of-war and the chronic fatigue that results from pitting these two drives together is an absolute tragedy and a symptom not of the flaws in the individual or biology, but of the juvenile nature of the cult that believes that studying money-making is more primary to well-being than studying parenting, or psychology, or meditation, or traumatic repair, or traumatic literacy. These huge gaps in a juvenile culture tear the individual apart by pitting these two drives in the body against one another.
Look away rather than toward the caregiver.
It's also important to understand why repeatedly abandoned children isolate and avoid. Meaning, an infant that seeks a mother and instead finds a plastic box in an orphanage, an infant that seeks their mother and instead finds a disinterested babysitter, an infant that seeks their mother and finds an addict watching television or playing video games, cries out for help and reassurance, and is met by silence or rage or apathy. And the message to the child's body is, I'm going to die because no one is attuning to me and forming a secure attachment. That message that I'm going to die initially results in frenetic screaming and tantruming to get more attention. In a sociopathic environment, that screaming and attention is met by being hit, by being smothered, by being shouted at, and being put angrily into distant rooms so that the parent can go back to managing the feelings that are produced by their culture and not responded to by their own culture, and are being elevated and triggered by the fact that the child, the infant, has not yet learned to lie and pretend that these horrors are not going on in daily life. When this is the case, the child becomes terrified of the loneliness and terror in their memory and in their body. And so anytime they start to seek attachment, they're already anticipating punishment and rejection on the other side of that effort, not love and attunement. And the freezing, the stiffening, the getting away from that terrain is trying to get away from the predicted outcome, which is to be hurt as a result of seeking attachment. Abused children feel that their greatest safety is to avoid their own feelings of pain and misery because they will not be tended to. And if they feel them, they will collapse. And so they stiffen and freeze the feelings that are coming up so that they can stay more vigilant in an environment that has demonstrated profound incompetence in the care of infants.
In contrast, babies in secure attachment relationships actively search the faces of adults to establish gaze-to-gaze contact and then socially engage by smiling, laughing, and cooing. Controlling attachment strategies and trauma. By the preschool years, now possessing language and motor skills they did not have in infancy, children with disorganized attachment status are observed by researchers to develop controlling tendencies, a pattern of behavior that manages or controls the caregiver's actions and reactions in one of two characteristic ways. One subgroup exhibits controlling caretaking behavior, a parentified style of relating by soothing, reassuring, and helping their mothers. The other subgroup exhibits controlling punitive behavior, attacking the mother verbally and/or physically, humiliating and devaluing her. Researchers note that the controlling caretaking pattern is more common in girl children and more common when mothers exhibit role reversal, that is, are needy and childlike, and guilt-inducing behavior. Controlling punitive behavior is more common in boys, especially in response to maternal hostility. In each case, the child has found a way to defend and attach simultaneously.
I want to acknowledge a couple of things in this passage. One of the reasons, among several, that I, as a boy or a man, move more towards anger is that need in a chauvinistic culture is associated with femininity, and needy boys are associated as being disgusting and weak because of their femininity. Because there has to be a response to so much terror, it can move into neediness and caregiving or anger. And in a cult that shames boys for being emotional, it's more likely that they would choose anger. The other, particularly when women are often programmed in an abusive culture to be afraid of anger in boys and in men. And so it's a better manipulative strategy, whereas girls expressing anger are more likely to be hit because it doesn't fit the stereotype. A mother may hit a girl and say, "Don't you talk to me like that," but she may be afraid of and tolerate that same behavior in her boy because she's learned to expect and fear that from men. So that's one piece of this mix. The other is the aspect of control. I noticed that between the age of 8 and 14, I carefully partitioned two aspects of my biology. One was feeling in favor of rationality and analysis and pattern recognition. And the other was spontaneity. Now, feelings and spontaneity are in the yin or feminine pole. You have structure and order and thought, which are in the masculine pole in both men and women. And you have spontaneity and depth and fluidity and emotionality that are in the yin and feminine pole in both men and women. Now, my father hated himself and hated other people and punished them in proximity, or in proportion to their proximity. So the fact that we were his family meant that he punished and hated us more than anyone else other than himself. Now, he would vent his frustrated rage as an intellectual by setting up verbal traps that anyone who didn't know him would walk into, and then he would humiliate them for stepping into those verbal traps. So he would ask leading questions in order to provoke an answer that he could humiliate and attack. Now, after being hit by this particular abuse cycle a few thousand times, I learned, first of all, that anytime he spoke, I couldn't reflexively respond. I had to cut off the spontaneous response because it felt so painful and alienating to be humiliated by him. So once I cut off the spontaneous response and showed no feeling on my face, because he would use the feeling to hone in on how to hurt me emotionally. So blocking all feeling in my face, blocking all feeling or affect in my voice, a symptom that remains to this day, meaning I can be feeling intense grief and pain, but my body has learned that that will be hurt and humiliated, and so it shows no affect. That was something that I semi-consciously, consciously, and unconsciously shut down between age 8 and 12 to accommodate a sadistically abusive father. Once I showed no feeling in my face and did not react spontaneously, had a flat affect on all levels. The next thing to do was to understand the trap that my father was trying to set. Having understood the trap that my father tried to set, because after you spend a few thousand rounds with anyone, you get the sense of the pattern, I would figure out by the age of 13, 14, where Michael was going with his trap, and which hole he wanted me to fall in, and what his response would be to demean me. Having determined that, I would then step over the trap in a very calculated move that did not acknowledge the game, because that's met with overt abuse. For example, one of the ways that abusive parents protect their abusive patterns is by attacking the child for naming the abusive pattern. So if I was to say, Michael, why do you want to torment us today? Why don't you torment someone your own size? And what pleasure does it give you to see someone reduced to helpless tears? He would fly into a rage and hit me, and he would say, don't sass your parents. So as a sensitive child that didn't like being hit, the abuse could not be named because it would reveal the inadequacy of the parent in an area he felt deeply inadequate and was already beating himself up. If you played along, though, he would just tie up all your thoughts and feelings into complete helplessness and rage and smirk when you burst into tears, in a culture that shamed you as a boy for having feelings. It was a no-win situation. By carefully stepping over his traps, or by laying a trap for him to step into, without acknowledging that we were playing in a hostile, sociopathic environment, meaning it is a cruel and sadistic human being who sets out to murder their child's feelings and innocence, and it is an act of hostility and hatred and rebellion for a 12 and 13-year-old to deliberately try and deflect that back on the abuser. And so the game and the cruelty was not acknowledged on either side. But after humiliating my father successfully and repeatedly by predicting the pattern and avoiding it, or letting him fall into his own hole by asking leading questions of my own with a straight face and no emotional affect, he turned his brutality onto less sophisticated victims. He had just as much self-hatred and pent-up anger as he ever did, but I had four younger siblings. And my four younger siblings were not as analytical, remained emotional, and were good victims for psychological torture. This is one way that a child can be trained to become hyper-controlling and to fear the healthy, spontaneous emotions and responses and bonding of any healthy adult in healthy community. When one successfully convinces the biology that to be healthy will get you targeted for being hurt, one can train a child not to be healthy.
To remain close to the parent while inhibiting the dependency needs usually associated with attachment. Phobia of therapy and the therapist. This legacy of disorganized attachment and controlling strategies affects all later adult relationships, including the therapeutic one. Vanderhart, Nijenhuis, and Steele call this latter phenomenon phobia of therapy and the therapist. To the extent that traumatized clients come to therapy craving the relief, understanding, and care offered by the therapist, proximity seeking,
I would just note that this naming of things comforts the Western mind, but it does not necessarily lead to any understanding. A Western individual is comforted often by a diagnosis, but when you learn a template from a parent that says basically authority figures can get you killed if you don't watch out, it doesn't matter who the authority figure is. That template says therapist equals authority figure, and so it will naturally engage, and one will default expect the therapist to behave the way the template dictates that your abusive parent behaved.
They are equally likely to experience fear and distrust of both the relationship and the process, either early in treatment or as the relationship with the therapist grows. The prospect of trusting someone, of being seen, of disclosing one's secrets does not bring relief, it brings trepidation. As Jessica Benjamin describes it, to be known or recognized is immediately to experience the other's power. The other becomes the one who can give or withhold recognition, who can see what is hidden, who can reach, conceivably even violate, the core of the self. The lived experience of traumatized individuals has created an unavoidable and painful paradox. Closeness cannot be trusted, but distance or aloneness is also not safe. Their experience was that being alone and without protection created greater vulnerability, while being in proximity was also not safe. Because they could not depend upon the protection of the non-offending caretaker, these clients are either loath to depend upon the therapist, or they assume the opposite, that their only safety lies in dependency. The yearning to self-disclose tends to conflict with the fear that self-disclosure will be used against the client, that secrets will not be believed, that he or she will be humiliated, not validated. Simon illustrates the dilemma in which therapist and client can find themselves.
I would also just notice in this tension dynamic that there is a correlation between the emotional template of two people in a couple or a romantic relationship and sexual arousal. Because the brain is the biggest sexual organ, and that the majority of pleasure or sensation or feeling in the sexual act is mental and emotional, meaning there's a very good reason when you believe you found your soulmate and are making love and you are projecting all of the wonderful things that you project around a soulmate onto a new partner. There is a reason that that is by far the most satisfying and profound sex. If you are deeply in love and deeply connected, the transcendent states that emerge are 3 times more pleasurable and satisfying and meaningful than just random masturbation and production of the same sensations purely physically. But the same is true in abusive dynamics. When one's emotions are locked in memories, traumatic memories of betrayal, humiliation, and abuse, the fact that emotions and thoughts produce most of the chemicals in the brain means that to activate the highest sexual arousal often involves reenacting the abuse templates that contain the most feeling. And hence we have in a materialistic culture that focuses on physical sexual arousal as the pinnacle of a romantic relationship. We have a whole science of BDSM, which is a science of communicating to one's partner how one has to perfectly abuse someone else, or how one must perfectly be abused to totally touch the footprint of the abusive childhood template in such a way as to release as many chemicals in the brain as possible, thus creating a peak sexual release that is, in some cases, divorced from all love, from all meaning, and is simply an addictive reenactment of the abusive template.
In coming to therapy, he expressed his wish for help, but his parts could not allow him to accept help, much less trust it. Each time I brought more warmth to my tone, more determination to help him, the more I could see Simon's body tensing up. When I leaned forward to make contact with him, I felt him pulling back. Although he verbalized a wish for help, I could feel him withdrawing from whatever I offered. If I leaned forward to emphasize a point, I could see his body stiffen and pull back.
When you care about someone, the last thing you want to do is upset them. And one of the ways that abused people infect non-abused people with their physiological and psychological disease is this training. If you're, in this case, a therapist, but it's just as much the case if you're a lover, if you notice that being healthy, being intimate, telling the truth, moving forward, being affectionate, trusting, smiling, all produce fear in your partner, and that being less healthy makes them relax, over time, the partner or therapist or colleague is trained systematically by the abused person to become more unhealthy in order to make the abused person comfortable.
Me. Seems like you want to take in what I'm saying, but it's hard, isn't it? Simon. It feels like you're trying to sell me something, and I should be careful because it might not be safe. Me. Yes, I can tell it doesn't feel safe. Your body is just trying to protect you, huh? It's saying, be careful. Don't just accept whatever you're told. Simon was paralyzed by an internal conflict. He wanted help with his debilitating thoughts and feelings, but somehow he couldn't allow himself to accept the help offered. To further complicate Simon's dilemma, different parts of him were in head-to-head conflict about the therapeutic relationship. His judgmental, cynical fight part questioned the therapist's credentials.
I'll just pause to note that part theory, the ability to differentiate the self into distinct parts at distinct ages and understand the value that each part plays in the formation of the whole personality or self, is one of the most vital sciences that any human being can learn. And it's paradoxically a science that less than 1% of the population is fluent in, because we willfully leave it out of all education.
Methods and orientation. His more intellectual going-on with normal life self, who had researched my work in advance, thought the approach seemed appropriate. His lonely, lost child part just yearned for the therapist to say something nice, something that would put a balm on his emotional wounds. The submit part, whose depressive beliefs about himself kept Simon perpetually dysphoric, both liked and felt threatened by the therapist's challenging of those beliefs as just a survival strategy. Not knowing which internal pull or voice was his, Simon alternately identified with all of them. At some appointments, he would be open to working on changing his relationship to the depression by understanding it as that of a young boy who had learned to keep himself quiet and shut down so he could fly below the radar. At other times, he would express ambivalence about continuing in therapy, or even anger that, "I've wasted all these years seeing therapist after therapist. This is just one more failed attempt." Each structurally dissociated part, driven by a particular animal defense response or combination of responses, tends to be biased in its perspective on attachment versus safety. As each is evoked on different days by different aspects of the treatment, the therapist can become confused and disoriented if he or she does not recognize the fragmentation and identify the parts.
Not just the therapist, but much more so the romantic relationship partner. When a person is disintegrated, it's referencing the fact that a variety of inner ages and a variety of survival and meeting need programs are in direct conflict with one another. One, in a simplistic paradigm of the self where it's all me, there's no differentiation. And so the person who goes through the wheel of their own fragmented self always identifies, without this technology, with whatever feeling or voice is loudest at the moment, which is often the feeling or voice that is least heard. So there is a voice in any abuse culture. There are two voices, a voice that says connect and a voice that says go away. Now, as soon as you speak for the voice that says, please connect with me, you're dishonoring the voice on the inside that says, go away, leave me alone. That voice then becomes dishonored and not heard. So if a partner says, please be close to me, don't leave me, please connect with me, and ignores the counter voice that says, get away from me, I'm scared of all people, when the partner listening to that responds and gets close, the fact that both people in the relationship are listening to the voice that says get closer and no one in the relationship is acknowledging the voice that's frightened and says get away, means that that voice will become animated and get louder and louder until the person bursts out with the exact opposite and says, get away from me, you're too cloying, it's too much. And then when the person gets away from them, they feel abandoned and feel like, why did you leave? Now, this state cannot be negotiated healthily with two ignorant grown-ups. At least one person has to understand part theory and needs to introduce it. And even that's not sustainable. They need to transmit that knowledge to the other partner and ask them to speak in parts. Now, this is a whole new science and way of connecting, and it becomes particularly important when you have an effective schizophrenia between multiple dissociated parts. When the one part wanted to get away so much and felt so helpless that they dissociated from the body and became unconscious but still act out instinctively. And then there's another part that desperately wants love and affection because they're being abused, that leads to them getting hurt, which also disconnects and leaves the body. And now you have two polar opposites in an individual that are going to vie for attention and whipsaw their partner back and forth. There's no way to win until both parts are conscious and can be integrated by the individual who has them, which requires a paradigm for doing so and requires practice, just like riding a bicycle, learning to type, learning English. This is a language that must be learned. Once it is learned, it becomes clear that there is no schizophrenia, that the 2-year-old desperately wants to be loved and doesn't want to be left, that the 6-year-old is having a fit about being molested, that the 12-year-old is depressed and cynical because every time they tell the truth, the grown-ups around them are too scared for their own survival and security to listen or protect the child. And every part has complete sanity. Every part makes sense. Every part played a role in the survival of that human being, and every part has pros and cons. When a person can talk like that and say, no, 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 my 5-year-old is getting triggered by your leaving, but my adolescent is still furious that you're close and doesn't trust you at all, but my 5-year-old trusts you and doesn't want you to leave. Then you can have a conversation with the lover and say, well, what do you think is the best one to listen to? Or could we play a board game and I won't touch you? And will that diffuse the adolescent? And your 5-year-old can feel safe that I'm not going to abandon you just because your adolescent has a tantrum. There's only one way to check in and respond to that dynamic. The individual has to ask the two parts and negotiate between them. That's the definition of an adult. When you have 5 fighting inner children or 5 fighting outer children, the adult must mediate and do what is best for the whole. And an adult response might say, you know what? I'm going to spend some time rebelling with my adolescent, and I'm going to take care of my 5-year-old so that she doesn't feel abandoned. And then I'll call you within 24 hours and I'll let you know how we can interact again. Now, that's a narcissistic adult. It's all about them. The more competent adult says, how is that for you? And what works best for you? Then you can reply and say, my 5-year-old feels like you're leaving because I did something wrong and my love isn't good enough. My 6-year-old feels jealous that you're going to go spend time with somebody else. My 10-year-old is afraid of telling you this truth because every time she opens her mouth, she gets punished. My 15-year-old is frustrated. He wants to have sex with you, and that's not on the table. And my 30-year-old is resigned because all relationships seem highly complicated and doomed to failure. I've never, by age 30, experienced a successful relationship. And my 45-year-old is profoundly compassionate and loving to you and to me. This is a tough set of dynamics in a dysfunctional and illiterate culture, and how we manage to maintain our humanity and grace to some degree in so much insanity is a miracle. And I will figure out how to take care of me, and please go take care of yourself, and we'll talk. And I'll let you know if this is too much for me, but it's not an issue of you being unlovable. It's an issue of the fact that in this culture, you may not be able to find anyone competent to love you as you are, including me, because I'm finding it hard enough to love all of myself. And you bring some of that up. And so thank you for asking. We'll touch base in 24 hours. That level of intelligence is missing in 99.99% of Western interactions. And it's not missing because we're flawed human beings. It's missing because something we would love to learn as human beings if it was not shamed and patronized by the chauvinism of a materialistic cult. Something that we would love to learn in high school is being denied. as all kinds of bullshit is shoved down the throats of our increasingly depressed, frustrated, and angry teenagers.
The attached parts often idealize the therapist and actively seek a relationship that at first may seem like healthy therapeutic collaboration. I need help, and you have expert help to give me. But over time, the client, blended with the attached part, becomes progressively more childlike or needy.
What's going on here, and I can speak from having 40 or so therapeutic relationships, is that there are parts in the attached parts in my psyche which I do not know how to love competently, because that was never modeled for me by a lover, a parent, a teacher, an authority figure. So it's not in the template. Now, if a therapist demonstrates a greater capacity to love a terrified small part of me than I have, that persona, that need of attachment inner child, experiences the therapist as a floating log in a stormy sea, the only thing they can hang on to and not go under. And so they cling to the therapist desperately. Finally, I found some place that I can hold on to. And then the therapist says, time's up, see you next week. And that small part that has no place to attach goes back to those stormy waters, holding their breath, hoping the therapist will show up and still be there and love them. And what it really wants to say is, get me out of this stormy water. I don't want to have to go back. Be more, be more.
Develops separation anxiety or is increasingly in crisis, driven by their innate.
And this separation anxiety is completely understandable. It is not a pathology. Every part of the self needs to be loved, and there are some parts of our psyche that have never, not even for 10 seconds, been loved in the ways they want to be loved. Now, it doesn't matter who loves them in an even slightly meaningful way. If they've never been loved before, it's like seeking oxygen and then having the oxygen mask removed. And some of these parts are unconscious initially. They've been pushed into the unconscious because they're too painful for the psyche to deal with, and there's too much incompetence to deal with them. Now, the therapist has competence, and so it comes into the therapist comes into the environment and demonstrates a reality that says, if this part of you that's been buried for the last 30 years now comes to surface, it will have oxygen rather than be gasping for breath and pull you under. So the psyche is willing to release that part from unconsciousness up into consciousness. And that part feels desperately happy to breathe. And then the therapist cuts off the environment and says, time's up. See you next week. In that environment, we now have a conscious part that is desperate to be loved, but is now not being loved because the therapist has not transferred their competency to the client. Now, this mirrors another phenomena that I've experienced with a number of lovers. I would say a majority of lovers, this has been an issue. So I've worked hard to understand and listen to and validate more parts than the average person. I have deep respect for each of my parts, and my main anger and hatred, to the extent that it's there, is at a cult that is persistent in its abuse and neglect of its own parts and mine by extension. And so one of the experiences that a woman has moving into my space is that I will start treating her parts the same way I treat the corresponding parts in me, which is superior in effect, meaning I'm delivering more oxygen for certain of my parts than the culture does in any other format. And that oxygen leads to a healthier integration with these parts of self. One of the things it means is that they're willing to talk to me, because I listen with respect and I don't shame and patronize them. If I shame and patronize anyone, it's the stupidity of the cult that teaches individuals to shame and patronize vital parts of their own psyche. So what her parts experience as she comes into my proximity is being treated better than she's being treated as a part in any other relationship or area of her life. So that part attaches to me like a drowning sailor in a storm on a lifeboat. It's finally found someone who knows how to care for and listen to it, which means it desperately does not want to go back into the water. Now, I have great empathy for these parts, and so my response is fine. But the sociopathic superego of my partner has a different idea. She's a modern woman. She has numerous interests. She is practicing her backgammon game. Then she's going to the book reading. Then she's doing the things that the cult ranks her as a sophisticated woman for doing. The trouble is they're out of sync with her parts. Her inner parts don't care about backgammon, don't care about Nike shoes, don't care about whether you make $100 or $300 an hour. They just care about being seen, being accepted, being respected, and being loved. But the superego internalized critical cult says that's weak. I should be more independent. So I have very independent, competent women start experiencing uncommon states of helplessness and dependency as the parts come to consciousness that she's been shoving down to look cool in a cult that values coolness over warmth, independence over connection, sociopathic self-centeredness over community and circling. Those parts are not happy that she wants to go play tennis. And I'm not happy to see those parts that are in clear distress being sublimated for the benefit of conformity with a cult that doesn't know what it's doing. So where this heads, as I understand it, is either to increasing degrees of dependency and need. Meaning, if there is only one life raft and you have 100 drowning sailors, you are not going to be able to use logic and reason to convince them to let go of the life raft. The solution is to make 100 life rafts and make them self-sufficient. So the question is, how am I going to teach my partner to love the parts of herself that are attached to me better than I love them? Because that will give her independence. Otherwise, she will be in an increasingly schizophrenic, dependent state that will usually freak out a Western psyche, because we are psychologically illiterate, so we don't know what's going on here, and we're afraid of the unknown to protect us from trauma. So in that situation, some people will withdraw from me to avoid the unfamiliar terrain. That's one solution. The other solution is increased dependency. But the only solution that's healthy is I ask the woman to understand this concept, one. And two, I ask her if she is willing to learn the art of loving the parts that are needy towards me well enough that she treats them better than I do, so that she can have a healthier self that's happier and more in love, but also maintain her freedom and independence. And if she will do this, the relationship grows in a healthy, loving, and mature way. If she will not do this, then the relationship will deteriorate, because even as her superego chooses to abandon her inner child in a state of need and depression or stress in order to go and play tennis or whatever it is she's doing, that 5-year-old came out to see me, and that 5-year-old will not forgive me for letting her superego abuse her. And in this culture, it's not appropriate to intervene or exert pressure to say, hey, I'm not going to let you abuse your 5-year-old. It's hurting you, it's hurting them, it's hurting our relationship, it's damaging our culture. I'm not allowing this. The idea that that is unhealthy, which is presented by the exaltation of freedom without exalting wisdom. Because if you have freedom and wisdom, freedom is a beautiful thing. If you have freedom and stupidity, freedom will get you killed, will traumatize you, will see you sick and diseased. You'll have a DSM manual with 5,000 separate Latin descriptions for 5,000 different symptoms of traumatic abuse. So this is the big challenge in a culture where you can count that the majority of people are not going to be loving themselves because they've never been loved. And when I say they've never been loved, I don't mean they've never been fed. Love happens on multiple dimensions, but that there are certain parts within the psyche that have never been loved. In fact, they have been hated. And those parts of the psyche are as valuable to the whole personality as any other part. And so thus begins the process of maturation. When I met my wife, who demonstrated traumatic symptoms, I suggested a routine that began every morning with an inner child meditation to love the parts that most needed help. Then I suggested media that could bring awareness to the issue. Then I suggested techniques. Then I practiced loving parenting towards her scared parts. Then we helped her older parts to stabilize and master life skills to better take care of the child. In that framework, the relationship became healthier and healthier day by day. Had she refused to learn to take care of herself, and I just take very good care of her, better than she does, she would become increasingly psychologically, physically, financially, and emotionally dependent in a way that leads to dishonesty. Because when you're completely dependent on someone, you cannot afford to tell the truth that will piss off the person you're dependent on. So you lie, like all children lie to their parents. Honesty comes from independence and love and abundance. And so because she excelled at that science, every single month we've been married and been in relationship, things have gotten better. And she's freer and freer. And the point of ultimate freedom would be to take such good care of yourself in so many clear ways with precision, meaning you know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and you do it with discipline and love, that leaving your partner, your well-being would go up because you'd be spending 100% of your time with you, and you take exceptionally good care of yourself. That is a state of joyful preference, to spend time with someone because it's fun, because it's novel, because you have a chance to love them. And I will leave it at that.